Welcome back to the AQS studio in Paducah, and this is lesson 5 of our Quilting with Triangles class. When we left our last class, you were getting ready to sew your blocks together, and I told you about pressing your seams for the 2 different color combinations of we have one corner that is teal and gold, or it could be green and gold if you use the other color scheme, and red and gold or the blue and gold. And so we have 2 blocks with each of those color combinations. And because we're alternating the blocks, it makes sense then that we would press our seams one way, starting maybe with go to the left on the first row, and then the right and on up for one color scheme, and then you reverse that for the other. And I've sewn my blocks into 2s here, but I want to show you what that does for you, because you can see by doing that and alternating the way we press, now we have our seams are alternated so that we're able to nest those seams when we sew the blocks together. So that's what I'm going to do next. I'm going to sit down here at the sewing machine and we'll sew these 2 and we'll have our top all finished. Okay, so now because we can nest these seams, I'm going to put a pin in the very first one here, just to make sure I get everything under the needle like I need to have it. I've been sewing since the last time I saw you, and I've already used 1 spool of thread and 1 filled bobbin. So when I told you you'd need to fill 2 bobbins, that's what you're going to need to finish this quilt off. Okay, so to nest our seams, you'll remember that we're going to push the bottom fabric and pull it right into the nest of seam in the top fabric. And so now we're just going to take our 1/4 of an inch seam, okay, so when we get to the next one, again, the bottom seam goes forward, the top one is the one I'm going to nest, and so I'm going to pull it right into that top seam. Again, we'll nest, pull the bottom right into the top seam. One of the things I can tell you when you're doing this is I can feel right here that both seams, if they're stacked one on top of the other, it will feel like a big glob of fabric. And you can feel that it's nice and flat. You'll notice too, I have a new thread saver. My other one got so filled up with thread, I decided I needed a new one. Here's the test. So we'll press that. Oh, you can see I missed right there a little bit. I'm going to pull that seam out. Matches up across. So that's why we use a seam ripper, isn't it? We're going to take a word from our sponsors, and when we come back, we're going to work on the Flying Geese border.
Trust the quality of Coats & Clark threads for all your quilting needs. With over 200 years of commitment to quality, selection, and innovation, Coats & Clark is the thread company trusted for generations.
I'm Amanda Murphy, and I'm a quilt and pattern designer. The Bernina Q16 is quilting magic. One of the hallmarks of a great quilting experience is when you lose yourself in your work.
Bernina, made to create.
Well, all right, now I told you that I had some problems with my points matching right here in the center. So I want to tell you what I did to fix that. I took it out about 3 or 4 squares out from the center, so that I had this whole section loose, and I went back and I repinned it again, but instead of sewing it with a regular seam allowance, I lengthened the stitch to 4 or 5, somewhere in that, so it's a longer stitch, and sewed it again, and I still had one little spot that I needed to fix after that, but then those stitches come out really, really easy. But that's something that you can do when you have lots of points that have to match. And so now we're ready to start working on the Flying Geese that's the borders for this quilt. I'm going to walk you through the steps, and then I'll finish sewing one of these so you can see exactly what it is that we're going to do. We're going to start with our 3.5 by 6.5 inch rectangles, and we will have our 3.5 inch squares, and we'll draw a line down the middle of those. Now, one of the things that's different between this drawn line and what we've done previously for the half squares and quarter squares is that we're going to sew on that line. So we'll lay that, and when you lay it out on your rectangle, you're going to put the line so it goes from the corner down here to the middle. And we'll sew directly on that line. And once that's done, we're going to trim off that back side and leave a 1/4 inch seam allowance and press it in place. So now we've replaced the corner of that block. The next step is to lay another square with the diagonal going from the corner down to the center. And now you can see how these overlap here. There should be a 1/4 inch seam allowance right here at this tip. So we'll sew that. Again, we're going to trim that off, and then when you lay it in place, it will make our 3.5 by 6.5 inch Flying Geese block. Okay, we're going to press that good. And again, the pressing is, we're going to set the corner, and now go with the grain of the fabric. If you do it that way, you're not going to be stretching that bias seam that we have there. Okay, so now we're going to take these to the sewing machine, and I'll show you how we line them up and sew them together. We want to make sure that we have these blocks going in the right direction, that the geese are going in the same direction. So I'm going to lay those over on top of one another. Now I found that it was easier if you started with the end that just is 2 layers of fabric and not on the end over here where we have the seams. But I am going to put a pin just to hold that together. I'm also going to pull this back, and you see how this isn't lined up right now? Well, if it isn't lined up now, it won't be lined up when you sew it. So I'm going to make sure that the seam line is completely lined up. And when you do that, you can take and put, do you see how I'm taking my nails and I'm making sure that that's completely lined up? We're going to put a pin in right there. Okay, so now we're ready to go to the sewing machine. I'm going to line it up with my 1/4-inch foot. Now, if you have a stiletto, I'm just using the points of my snips. But one of the things that you'll want to do is make sure that all of that seam, because you've got 4 seam allowances coming together there. And it doesn't hurt to slow down as you do this. One more stitch. I'm going to pull my pin. Now I'm going to make sure that we hold that so it stays down and goes right off the edge so we get a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. Okay, so when we do that, now you can see that we have our seams are lined up. Now, one thing I did different when I pressed this is I pressed these seam allowances on the back open, and I'm just going to do that by taking my fingers and my nail and just running along it like that. And now I can take it to the iron and set the iron on it and press that good and flat. And so now we have our unit put together. I've already sewn a whole row of these together, and so you can see I have all those seam allowances pressed open. And now we're ready to put it on the edge of our quilt. We're going to be making 4 sets like this. These are 5 flying geese put together, and it takes 4 on each side. And then on the top and the bottom, we're going to add a 3.5 inch square in the corner, and that will complete then the complete border around the edge of the quilt. While I get ready to sew this border to the quilt, we'll take a short word from our sponsors.
Scissorman here, founder of Fomori Cutlery. Chances are, if you're watching this, you're a needle artist. And needle artists like yourself from around the world have trusted the Fomori brand as their preferred cutting instruments for the past 20 years. To learn more, go to famcut.com.
So now we're ready to use our positioning pin method again to get the joints where these come together all lined up. So I'm going to begin by putting a pin right here in the end. And you'll notice that I have the border on the bottom and the quilt on the top so that we can pay attention to what happens to these seam allowances that are in the middle of each of our flying geese blocks. Okay, so now the joint for this is right here. So I'm going to put it right in that corner. And then I'm going to go to the border piece and I'm going to put my pin in right in that corner. Now you're going to pull those together. The positioning pin is straight up and down. And now I'm going to put another pin in right close to that positioning pin. And again on the other side of that seam, I'll do exactly the same thing. Now you'll notice that the seam allowance here on the back side is pressed open. Now I'll pull that positioning pin out and we'll move on to the next one. I'm going to put the pin in right where those two seams come together. And now I'm going to do the same thing on the back side, on the border. Again, positioning pin right straight up and down. I'm holding it with my fingers. Put a pin in on one side and put a pin in on the other side. Let's get a bigger pin, thinner pin. Got lots of fabric we're messing with right there. So we'll continue to do that all along the side here of this quilt. Now again, this would be a place if you're not comfortable with sewing the seam with the regular stitch first, because we do have quite a few places where it has to match. Feel free to lengthen your stitch, run it like a basting stitch so you can check them, and then you can adjust anything before you sew that final seam. So now we're ready to sew, and we're going to sew 1/4 of an inch seam allowance down the edge of the quilt. Now this is where you want to watch. We're down here to where we have this seam that you want to, again, if you have a stiletto, or I just use my snippers, we're just going to make sure we hold that, make sure all of those seam allowances lay in place as we sew. Got my pin in there funny. So again, this one is where we used our positioning pin. I'll sew right up to that first pin. You see there that it tried to turn over on me, so you just stop and go slow here if you have to. We'll pull out the next pin, and we're ready to continue on now till we get to the next joint. Now one of the things that as you're sewing this together, you can see that some of our seams, we can actually see that joint that we pinned together. It's right there. And so you want to eyeball so that you run right over that when you stitch this seam down. And now we're almost done. Pull out our last pin. And now we're ready to check our border. So that they should come out right where we pinned them. And I've already sewn one border on this quilt. So now we have 2 borders sewn on. And now you'll pin the top and bottom borders exactly the same way, and that 3-inch square will end up right here in this corner. Now I want to show you one other way to do the Flying Geese block, and it's called the no waste Flying Geese block. And I'm having you use the single Flying Geese because I think it makes it a little bit more accurate. And but sometimes when you're in a hurry and you only need 4 of these, like this would be enough to do a sawtooth star block because you'd have 4 flying geese that would make the points on all 4 sides. If we want this to finish 6 inches long, then we know we have to have more than 6 inches to start with, right? We're going to add 1.5 inches to the 6 to give us a 7.5 inch square. And then how big do you cut the squares to go in the corners? Well, you need to have those 4 inches, an inch bigger than what you need to be finished. So we want this to be 3 inches finished. So squares will be 4 inches. The big square will be 7.5 inches. So we're going to take our squares and we're going to lay them in the corner so that the diagonal line goes from corner to corner. And then we're going to sew that on both sides of the line, just like we did for the half square triangles. The next step is we need to cut on the drawn line. So now we have 2 pieces. The next thing we'll do is we will take that to the iron, and again, just like we did before, we're going to set the corner, and press it flat. Set the corner, and press it flat. We have 2 of those. So the next step is to take the squares that you've drawn your lines on, and we're going to put that in the empty corner of this block of the square. And so our seam now should run right across the seam that we've already sewn. So I'm going to sit down and sew on either side of the line 1/4 of an inch. Again, this is something you can chain piece if you have to make quite a few of these. Now I'm going to turn that all around and we'll sew down the other side. We'll cut those squares apart. Now we'll bring it back over to the iron. We'll set in the seams, set that stitching line in. And now we're going to cut on the drawn line between the two stitchings. And so now we're ready to press, and again we'll do just like we did before. Set the corner, and so now you can see on this block, okay, so we've got our corners here, and we should have 1/4 of an inch seam allowance where the 2 squares come together. And so now we've made 4 Flying Geese blocks. Now, I would make sure that you trim these up because they should be 3.5 by 6.5 at this stage. And so I would lay my ruler on there. I get rid of those little tips in the corners and down here at the joint. You don't need that extra when you're trying to sew them together. Now, I think that to me this is not quite as accurate as it is when you start with the 3.5 by 6.5 inch rectangle and the 3.5 inch squares. So that's just another way to do the Flying Geese block. And we're going to take just a short word from our sponsors and we'll be right back.
You know, it's never been proven, but we all know that the floor gets 2 inches farther away every year on your birthday. We can help you out with that. You need a design wall. Check us out at offthewallquilt.com.
Tracy's Tables has all of your custom sewing table needs. Visit tracystables.com to see the complete line of unique tables, carts, and shelves. And all of Tracy's Tables are made in the USA.
So today you've learned 2 different methods for sewing the Flying Geese blocks, and those are our borders. So for next time you need to get the borders on your quilt, because next week we will be making our quilt sandwich and doing some quilting on our quilt. But before you leave today, don't forget to go and register for the free prizes. We have some great prizes from our sponsors. Fomori Cutlery is giving 5 $100 gift certificates. We have a great tote for your sewing machine from Bernina. 2 different boxes of thread from Coats & Clark. All of the lamps like we're using here on the set from the Daylight Company. Off the Wall Quilt with the rulers, the ruler magic to keep them from slipping. And from Tracy's Tables, the cutting table that has the leaves that fold out and it folds down into a very good size for you to be able to keep it in your sewing room and just use it when you need it. So until next time, we'll meet you right back here in Paducah and we'll be working on finishing up this quilt.